Hi folks, in the last video we essentially discussed the initial ways that you might respond to an image uh, through an explanation of what you see and what you feel in regard to just your initial reaction to it. And so what we want to do in this next video is explain how you go into an analysis of some more specific artistic choices that you feel an artist or a photographer may be choosing here, and essentially what you're doing is you're interpreting that artist and photographer's intent. So essentially what you want to do is you want to reflect on elements within the text, and by the text I mean either the photograph or the painting. So what you want to do is look at things like the major shapes and colors and how they're arranged. Are there light and dark areas within the image or the painting, and are they arranged symmetrically? Is that image organized or is it chaotic, and what might these things say about the author's intent or the artist's intent? Is one area darker or heavier or brighter and lighter than another? Does the design make you think of or evoke a particular memory, emotion, historical period, or memory, that type of thing? So where we can begin with a more specific analysis is with color. So what you want to do is look at how the color of the painting or the photograph focuses your attention in a particular way. Does it create contrast? Does it create culturally specific and symbolic meanings? How does each of these interpretations contribute to the artist's overall purpose? And so let's return to the painting by Julie Heffernan and discuss how some of these things might be at work there. So one of the first things that I notice about this image is the predominant color that's found here, and that's gold. So in our culture, gold has a particular meaning. Sometimes it is emblematic of wealth. But another thing about the color in this photo or in this painting is that it creates a feeling of warmth. So, how might these things be important? And look at the positioning of the gold versus the black of the floor and of this fireplace. Now, black in our culture typically has another specific cultural meaning, and that sometimes is negativity, mystery, the unknown. And if what we're talking about here is someone who is uncertain of who they are, or they're seeking to understand who they are, or they're seeking to understand the world and the way the world works, or just life in general, the positioning of this body is extremely important because it stands in front of this black abyss of nothingness, and it's standing atop a black abyss of nothingness. So, what you could do is talk about how that might be important. Now, gray in our culture represents confusion. Like if you think of like someone with their head in the clouds, like the gray clouds would represent the confusion that they're feeling. There's also gray smoke here. There's also, a lot of white birds. Now, you could go into a discussion of what white means. White represents innocence and purity. So it's like on the bottom, in the bottom half of the painting, you've got all this darkness and uncertainty, but then at the top, you've got all this wealth. You've got innocence. Those types of things. And so what type of meaning might be created here, and how does that relate back to what you saw as what you felt maybe the initial purpose or message of this painting was? And so that's the type of thing you would think about when you look at color. You could also, look at the placement of the items within inside of the mirror here, and notice that there's another doorway or another frame there of some type, and that there's red inside of it, and then you could discuss what you think the red might mean. But anyway, those are just some ideas. And another thing you might notice is that there are more acorns on the mirror. Now that's a symbol, and we're going to talk about symbols later, but it's also something else for you to think about. Another thing as far as placement and color goes is the fact that, these birds are faced outward and they're of different colors, and so you could talk about perhaps what that means as well. So after you've attempted to arrive at some type of analysis or interpretation of color, the next place you want to go is or the next technique to use is figure ground contrast. And essentially what that means is, what's in front of the painting or the photograph and what's behind it, and how does this arrangement suggest some type of meaning, and how does that relate to the artist or the photographer's overall intent. So if we go back to this image of Heffernan's, what's completely in the background is what's inside of this mirror. Now what do mirrors do? They reflect reality, and we talked a little while ago in the last video about how it was that it looks like this person was standing in front of the mirror, and when we look in the mirror, what is it we're looking for? We're looking to see ourselves. So she's attempting to understand herself. So you might have to talk about what some of these things in the mirror mean and what you think they might mean. Again, acorns we talked about a little while ago, like the acorns on the floor, represent rebirth and life. So why is it that the artist has placed acorns on the mirror? You could think about what that might mean. So how does what's in front relate to what's in back? How is there a meaning or a relationship suggested there? That's sort of what you need to talk about when you look at these two things. And again, don't forget that when you do look at those two things, you need to relate them back to what you see as perhaps the artist's or the photographer's overall purpose or message that they're attempting to communicate in the piece. So after you've looked at figure ground contrast, you also want to look at symbols. Now we've talked about what some of these might be in this painting so far. The things like the mirror itself, the birds, what birds represent, what butterflies represent, what acorns represent, what fire represents. We didn't really talk about what the castle might represent, but you could discuss that as well. And then again, of course, the colors themselves are symbolic. So when you look at each one of these particular different symbolic and cultural messages that the painter has placed in the either in the photograph or in the painting, whether we're talking about the photographer or the painter, what you want to think about again with this is how does each of these interpretations that you're arriving at contribute to what you see as the artist or photographer's overall purpose. In other words, how does each of these relate to the overall message that you think that the artist or photographer is attempting to communicate? So after we've looked at symbols, what we can look at is juxtaposition. Now juxtaposition means things that are placed beside one another. And so when we take something and we place it beside something else, what we essentially do is we create an association between these two things and a suggested relationship between the two of them. And so what you want to do is look at the photograph and look at the painting and ask yourself, okay, this placement of this one item beside this other, what relationship is suggested between these two here, and how does each of these interpretations contribute to the artist or photographer's overall purpose? So let's go back to the Heffernan painting and discuss what we mean by this. So again, by juxtaposition we mean items that are placed beside one another. So here one juxtaposition is that we have butterflies juxtaposed with this castle that is on fire. And so perhaps we can go back to our story of the phoenix rising from the ashes and discuss that the only way this individual could have freedom is by breaking down and tearing down all that she felt she knew, so that she could gain a new perspective. Or you could say that the body is juxtaposed to the grayness of the frame of the fireplace itself. And because the body is juxtaposed with that, we understand that the body is contained within the symbolic confusion, because remember we said gray was symbolic of confusion. So you could go through many items here and discuss that, the fact that the acorns are juxtaposed with the black of the floor, the fact that the acorns are juxtaposed with the blue of the dress, and that they're at her feet, the fact that butterflies are drawn downward toward the acorns, and that's a juxtaposition there. So what you want to do is talk about what suggested meanings are created by the placement of these items in the image. Another method for analysis is to look at or look for repetition, similarity, and proximity. And we sort of were discussing some of these things already, but let's take a more careful look at it. So when we talk about repetition, similarity, and proximity, what we're looking at is things like, does the author group similar colors, sizes, and shapes in any way? Are there particular items that are close to one another or far apart? What meaning is suggested by this placement? How does this image use space? Does it use a lot of white space, or is it cluttered and busy? How does each of these interpretations contribute to the artist or photographer's overall purpose? So let's look at, again, Heffernan's painting, and let's talk about how some of these things might be at work here. We've sort of touched upon them already, but let's look at them in a little more detail. So there are several repetitions that are most noticeable to me in this painting, and the most obvious one, of course, is all the birds. So why have the repetition of the birds in the painting? Well, we talked about earlier why or how birds represent symbolically the idea of freedom. So perhaps that's what the artist is attempting to emphasize here, is perhaps that instead of remaining an agnostic, that this individual has chosen to follow a certain path, and perhaps this has given her freedom. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. There are multiple ways to see it, though. And again, we have the repetition of butterflies. This also represents freedom. We also have a repetition of acorns. We've got it in the pattern on the mirror, and we've got them on the floor. So, all of these things represent, new beginnings, freedom. So, why is it then, you think, that all these ideas of representations of new beginnings and freedom are related to the idea of this title, which is Portrait of Self as Agnostic? And so that would be, something that you would want to explain in this particular analysis. And you could also, again, go back to fire here and talk about how fire is also representative of those ideas. But again, the repetition, it would be, those items. Now, proximity means what items are located close to others and what that might mean. For instance, why is it that the acorns on the floor are so far away from the acorns on the mirror? Like, why do that? Why place these things so far apart? And why place these acorns in the black on the floor, and then these acorns are gold and they're on a mirror? What meaning is created in that way? So that's what we mean by proximity. Similarity, you would look at things that are similar, and that's a similar conversation to the one we just had, but you might see some other things there. So look for all these different types of things. Each one of these things is going to help you get another layer of meaning out of this painting or this photograph, and that's what you want to do. But remember, whatever interpretation you come up with, that you need to relate it back to the author's overall purpose, or what you see as that overall purpose. Most paintings or photographs don't use a lot of text either, but if they do, you want to be sure that you think about things like what font is used here, sort of what impression does this font convey or emotional feeling, how does the text function with the image, and are there any relationships suggested with that, and then how are all these things related back to the author's overall purpose. Now, here's an example by Rene Magritte. The French phrase here at the bottom says, "This is not a pipe." So obviously this is a pipe. So why would Magritte use the phrase in the text here, "This is not a pipe," and why would he use it in this flowing script like this? So you want to, and what emotional feeling does this create? And so those are the types of things that you'd want to discuss in a discussion of text. So after you've gone through each of the smaller elements of the bigger work and analyzed them and talked about what they might mean, now it's time to put everything back together and communicate what you now see after you've analyzed all these small pieces, and to communicate your interpretation. So when you do this, you want to return back to some of the same questions that you asked in the beginning. Where were your eyes drawn first, and why? Why the emphasis on this particular area of the painting or the photograph? Why did the artist or the photographer draw your eyes there? What was their meaning in doing so? Why did they emphasize this image? Back to the general mood and the reaction to colors and other key elements, and go back to what you initially saw as a story and what you now see as as the story and talk about why you may have seen different things. Another aspect you may want to delve into is any historical, cultural, political, or sociological or economic or cultural attitudes you see reflected there as well.